In this episode, we're going to make audits feel less like a surprise inspection and more like a predictable part of running a privacy program responsibly. Audits can sound intimidating to new learners because the word suggests someone is looking for failure, yet a well-designed audit is really a structured way to confirm what is true, what is working, and what needs strengthening before problems grow. The moment you treat audits as normal program maintenance, you start building habits that reduce stress and increase trust across the organization. Leaders want to know whether privacy controls actually operate the way the policy claims, and audits are one of the few ways to answer that with evidence instead of confidence. By the end, you should understand how to plan an audit by defining scope, gathering and evaluating evidence, choosing sensible sampling approaches, and running corrective action workflows that turn findings into lasting improvement. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CIPM in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good audit plan begins with clarity about the purpose of the audit, because different purposes lead to different scopes and different levels of detail. Sometimes the purpose is governance oversight, meaning leaders want assurance that core controls like rights operations and retention are working as designed. Sometimes the purpose is regulatory readiness, meaning the organization wants to be able to demonstrate compliance if questioned by a regulator. Sometimes the purpose is customer or partner assurance, meaning external parties want proof that privacy claims are backed by real control operation. The purpose also influences the tone, because an audit meant for improvement should feel like a learning exercise, while an audit driven by a contractual requirement may be more formal and documentation-heavy. When the purpose is explicit, you avoid the common beginner mistake of trying to audit everything at once, which overwhelms teams and produces shallow results that do not guide real decisions. Defining scope is the next step, and scope is where many audits fail before they even start because it is written either too broadly or too vaguely. Scope should specify which processes, systems, teams, and data types are included, along with the time period being examined. For example, if you are auditing data subject rights fulfillment, you may decide the scope includes intake, verification, triage, fulfillment, and vendor coordination for requests received in the last quarter. If you are auditing retention enforcement, you may scope to a set of systems that hold higher-risk personal data and to the scheduled deletion jobs that should have run during a defined window. Scope should also identify exclusions, not to hide problems, but to prevent misunderstandings about what the audit can conclude. A well-scoped audit is defensible because it can honestly say what was assessed and what was not, which helps leaders interpret results without overconfidence. Once scope is set, you need to define audit criteria, which are the standards or expectations you are measuring against, because you cannot evaluate control effectiveness without a reference point. Criteria can include internal policies, documented procedures, contractual commitments, notice statements, and applicable legal requirements, depending on what the audit is meant to support. Many privacy programs also refer to recognized control frameworks, such as the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, Series or Service Organization Control Reporting, like System and Organization Controls, SOC. Not because those labels are magic, but because they provide structured control language. If your organization uses NIST guidance for security-related controls, that can inform criteria as well, as long as you are clear about what it is being used for. The audit plan should connect each control you test to its criteria, so findings are not just opinions, but are linked to a defined expectation. When criteria are explicit, conversations about findings become productive because teams can see exactly what was required and what was observed. Evidence is the heart of audit work, and planning for evidence means deciding what proof you will accept to show that a control exists and is operating. Evidence can include policies and procedures, but it must go beyond those because documents alone do not prove behavior. For example, a written procedure for identity verification and rights requests is not enough. You also need case records showing verification steps were actually performed. Evidence can include ticket logs, workflow timestamps, approval records, system configuration exports, access review attestations, training completion records, vendor confirmations, and incident response timelines. Evidence also includes interviews and walkthroughs, where you ask control owners to demonstrate how the process works and to show the artifacts it produces. Planning evidence in advance reduces friction because teams know what to prepare, and it reduces bias because auditors are not cherry-picking whatever happens to be available. Strong evidence planning is what turns an audit from a debate into a disciplined evaluation. Sampling is how you make audits practical, because most privacy processes generate too many records to examine one by one. Sampling means selecting a subset of cases, transactions, or events and testing that subset for compliance with the criteria, then using results to infer how the process likely performs overall. The audit plan should define the sampling method, such as random selection, risk-based selection, or stratified selection that ensures you cover different categories, like different request types or different regions. Risk-based sampling is especially useful in privacy because not all cases carry equal impact. So you may want to sample more heavily from high-risk areas like deletion requests, sensitive data workflows, or vendor-dependent processes. Sampling plans should also specify sample size logic in a way that is reasonable, even if it is not mathematically perfect, because the goal is to detect meaningful patterns, not to pretend you have tested everything. When sampling is documented and consistent, findings feel fair because the selection method is clear and repeatable. Interviews and walkthroughs deserve explicit planning because they are often where you discover gaps that documentation hides. A walkthrough is not just asking someone to describe the process. It is asking them to show how a real case moves through the system, step by step, and where decisions are recorded. For example, during a walkthrough of vendor deletion, you might watch how a request is sent, how the vendor responds, where confirmation is stored, and how exceptions are tracked. Interviews also help you test whether people understand the purpose of the control, because misunderstanding often predicts future drift even if records look compliant today. Planning these conversations includes choosing who to speak with, ensuring you cover both central privacy roles and operational control owners, and preparing questions that map back to criteria. The audit plan should also ensure these sessions are respectful and efficient, because the goal is not to interrogate people, but to validate control operation and identify improvements. When interviews are structured, they produce evidence and insight without turning into informal storytelling. Control testing is the step where evidence and sampling turn into conclusions, and it requires careful definitions of what counts as pass, fail, or partial. A common beginner mistake is treating control testing as a binary judgment when many controls have degrees of effectiveness. For example, a rights fulfillment process might meet timelines but fail to include complete system searches, which is not a pass just because the clock was met. A retention process might delete data from primary systems but leave old copies in analytics tables, which may be a partial control effectiveness issue depending on criteria. The audit plan should define how results are recorded, how exceptions are handled, and how auditors avoid making conclusions based on single anecdotes. It should also define how auditors handle conflicting evidence, such as when a policy says one thing but case records show another, because the operational truth is in what happens, not in what was intended. Clear testing rules make findings defensible because they show consistent judgment rather than subjective impressions. Audit planning should also include how findings will be categorized and communicated, because a pile of raw observations does not help leaders unless it is organized into meaningful risk and action. Findings are often grouped by severity, such as high, medium, and low, but severity must be tied to clear logic like potential harm to individuals, likelihood of recurrence, legal exposure, and operational impact. A missing approval step in a high-risk external sharing workflow is not the same as a minor formatting inconsistency in a template, and leaders need that distinction to prioritize work. Findings should also be linked to root causes where possible, such as unclear ownership, missing automation, insufficient training, or vendor limitations. The audit plan can specify the format of findings, including what evidence supports them and what criteria they relate to, so recipients can trust the conclusions. When findings are written as clear, evidence-based statements, teams are more likely to accept them and move into remediation rather than arguing about wording. Corrective action workflows are where audits either become valuable or become shelf decoration. because findings without follow-through simply document risk instead of reducing it. A corrective action workflow defines how findings are assigned to owners, how remediation steps are planned, and how completion is tracked to closure. Ownership must be explicit, with a person or function accountable for each action, not just a vague team name, because ambiguous ownership is a common reason findings linger for months. The workflow should also include due dates and escalation paths, especially for high-severity items, so leaders can intervene when remediation stalls. A practical approach is to treat corrective actions like managed projects, with clear tasks, dependencies, and required evidence of completion, such as updated configurations, revised procedures, or proof of vendor changes. When corrective actions are managed with discipline, audits become a continuous improvement engine rather than a periodic report. Retesting and validation are essential parts of corrective action workflows, because fixing a problem is not the same as proving it is fixed. Retesting means checking the remediated control again, often using the same criteria and similar evidence expectations as the original audit, to confirm the change actually works in practice. For example, if the finding was that rights cases lacked documented verification, retesting should sample new cases after the fix to confirm verification is now consistently recorded. If the finding was that retention jobs were not running, retesting should confirm jobs executed and that data older than the retention threshold is no longer present in the scope systems. Validation should also consider whether the remediation created side effects, such as breaking a business process or shifting risk into another area, like untracked manual workarounds. Planning for retesting at the start prevents the common outcome where teams declare success without evidence, only for the same issue to return later. A defensible program treats remediation as complete only when it is verified. Audit planning should also address documentation hygiene, because the audit process itself creates records that may be reviewed later by leaders, regulators, or partners. The audit file should include scope, criteria, sampling approach, evidence collected, testing steps, findings, and corrective action tracking, all in a consistent structure. This does not mean writing a novel. It means leaving a clear trail that explains how conclusions were reached. Documentation should also respect confidentiality and minimum necessary principles, because audits can involve sensitive artifacts like incident reports, employee records, or customer case details. The plan should define who can access audit materials and how long they will be retained, because keeping audit evidence forever can create unnecessary exposure. When audit documentation is clean and controlled, it supports accountability without creating a new repository of unmanaged sensitive data. This balance is part of audit defensibility and is often overlooked by beginners. A well-run audit program also fits into the organization's broader governance rhythm, rather than being an isolated event that surprises teams. Planning should consider timing, such as aligning audits with major releases, vendor renewals, or annual policy review cycles, so audits test meaningful activity rather than quiet periods. It should also consider how audit results feed into leadership reporting and privacy metrics dashboards, because findings often explain why certain metrics are trending poorly. If rights timelines are slipping, an audit might reveal a bottleneck in vendor responses or a missing system in the search scope, and that insight should guide leadership decisions. The plan should include how results will be presented to different audiences, from operational owners to executives, because the level of detail and the focus on decisions will vary. When audits are integrated into governance, teams treat them as normal and useful, which reduces defensiveness and increases cooperation. Integration turns audits into a predictable feedback loop that strengthens the program over time. It is also important to plan for coordination with related functions, especially security and compliance, because privacy audits often overlap with controls those teams care about. Security may already have processes for access review, logging, incident response, and vendor security assessments, and privacy audits can leverage that work while focusing on how it affects personal data and external commitments. Compliance teams may manage broader enterprise audits that include privacy-relevant controls, and aligning schedules and evidence expectations can reduce duplication. Coordination prevents audit fatigue, where teams feel like they are constantly being asked for similar artifacts by different groups. It also reduces gaps, because privacy and security can cross-check each other's assumptions, such as whether a security control actually supports a privacy claim made in a notice. Planning these interfaces requires clear roles, such as who owns the audit plan, who conducts testing, and who approves final reporting, so accountability is not lost in a multi-team effort. When coordination is planned, audits become more efficient and more credible. As you bring this episode to a close, remember that planning for audits is really planning for confidence, because it is how you replace vague assurances with evidence that privacy controls are operating as intended. Clear scope prevents the audit from becoming either a shallow sweep or an endless project, while explicit criteria ensure everyone agrees on what good looks like. Thoughtful evidence planning and sensible sampling make the work practical and fair, producing results that reflect reality rather than isolated stories. Structured testing rules and well-written findings turn observations into decisions leaders can make, instead of arguments about interpretation. Corrective action workflows, complete with ownership, deadlines, escalation, and retesting, ensure audits actually reduce risk rather than merely documenting it. When audits are integrated into governance and coordinated with related functions, they become a steady improvement loop that keeps the privacy program aligned with real operations, resilient under scrutiny, and trustworthy to the people whose data it handles.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.